And 3, 2, 1. The world of opposition is one of ivory tower academics that don't understand the lived experiences of those within their movements. What we're going to show you on Opening Government is 1, that the movements are going to be more successful on our side of the house, 2, that we get less external backlash, and 3, that we create more of a safe space for people within the movements. Before that, some framing. I think examples of just kind of academization of these movements looks like the discussion of critical race theory within BLM, or the discussion on the inclusion of transgender people within academic feminism. The comparative is probably emphasizing the lived experiences of individuals a lot more. I think this is the comparative one because there's a competing trend within social movements of the status quo as to whether to emphasize academic literature or these kind of lived experiences. And secondly, because you want to probably try to hear from the people that you seek to help. Movements then on our side of the house have 2 purposes. 1, successfully pressuring for policy change in order to improve the lived experiences of these people, and 2, providing a safe space and a tool of expression for those that are affected by discrimination, regardless of whether they're successful. So firstly, let's talk about why these movements are more successful on our side of the house. And the important thing here is to characterize who these academics are and what messages they spread. Firstly, oftentimes they are well-intentioned, but have a number of blind spots, which means that they promote problematic things. So for example, they're often the most privileged people of that minority. Definitionally, they've been able to get a degree, which often requires a high level of money, a high level of like educational attainment, etc., which not everyone within the social movement will have. Secondly, it oftentimes leads to a focus on sort of more post-materialist issues within these social movements. So for example, microaggressions rather than actual issues faced, because this is what academics are familiar with, right? Often when you're a professor or a renowned academic, you will be in a financially more sound position, meaning you don't have to think about those kind of things. Instead, you think about microaggressions. But even if this is not true, they often use methods or jargon, which is too complex for many people to understand. And academics historically look at things top down, which we think is just incredibly bad. What does this mean for the success of the movement? 4 things. Firstly, on accessibility, I think it reduces buy-in because it's too complicated for people to understand. So if you're talking at a BLM protest about critical race theory, that probably deters people who think they're not smart enough to understand that concept or don't understand what you're talking about. This is especially problematic because people within these movements often have existing imposter syndrome where they feel like they're not in the right place or they don't deserve to be there because they've internalized structural oppression. I think this means if you put that kind of jargon in front of them, that's just going to hurt them. Secondly, I think it often reduces buy-in because those that are most affected by discrimination are those that don't have the same educational opportunities, so they don't have the chance to get to the level in the first place where they're able to understand these kind of narratives. So you especially include those people that you want to include, which is the most vulnerable people within your movement. But secondly, I think it reduces political capital, and that's because even if it doesn't reduce like buy-in from your movement per se, it's easy to disregard suggestions as elitist ideas that don't have popular buy-in, right? So as a politician, if you're looking at the BLM movement and you're saying, oh, they're just talking about critical race theory and they're just dominated by academics, it's easy to discard that as being within an ivory tower. I think this means you reduce external buy-in from politicians and they're less likely to get policy change. Thirdly, the movement as a whole becomes dominated by very few academics that no longer represent the people that the movement is meant for. Even if they have these kind of good intentions, they don't have the same lived experiences. So they'll focus on different issues like microaggressions versus the worst excesses of racism. Why? And then finally, I think the figurehead you have for your movement will often change. And this is incredibly important. If you, for example, compare MLK to Cornel West, one is like far more motivating for your movement, right? Represents the lived experiences of the people you want to motivate. And the other is an academic. That's just not going to help you to get that kind of buy-in or success. But secondly, then, let's look at external buy-in and why you're likely to get more backlash on our position. I'll take you in a moment. I think the problem is that right-wing people or people who oppose your movement use this as an opportunity to pick their own academics that dispute the statements of social justice movements. Like in the case of Jordan Peterson, like using his kind of standing as an academic to rebut the feminist movement. The problem is that they do this under the safeguard of academic debate, which means they often get more attention or things like protected speech, which means it's harder to cancel them, which means it's harder for you as a social movement to go against that. Social movements are basically starting this trend of academization. You're going to make it worse on opposition because you get those kind of right-wing people that are academics to fight back. The counterfactual is that you have to rely on people within the particular community who have lived experiences to speak out against the movement. I think these people often have less of a platform and are taken less seriously than someone with an academic title. So as a movement itself, it's far easier to like disregard these people or say why they're wrong. The impact here is then people in these communities have to read, like one, it's easier to get your policies through because you don't have that kind of academic backlash, but two, often there's harm in this academic debate in itself, right? Because people then have to engage with this academic debate at university, often means these minorities like transgender students are exposed to this academic debate in the first place. That's incredibly harmful. Before I move on, I'll take closing.
Right, there seems to be a tension in your case insofar as you think these academics are given prestige and understanding simply on the basis of academics, yet somehow that doesn't convince the broader population to agree with those ideas. Where do you draw the line?
So the problem is, yes, they get some sort of prestige and reputation initially. The problem is in terms of policy change specifically, where you're not going to get that same kind of buy-in from politicians because it will seem like this elitist view. Like, yes, you'll get some buy-in initially, but it doesn't convince politicians. Okay, why does the movement become less of a safe space for people affected by discrimination? And this is important regardless of whether the movement gets any change or gets any policies. Firstly, academics crowd out people within these movements who are less able to express themselves. And this is because academics are often more able to speak publicly or have experience in essay writing, etc., which means that they crowd out the kind of people that can't express their voices in this way and are sort of less privileged. Secondly, the people that are within these movements should always be able to express themselves in a way they want. I think once academics enter the movement, it's far more likely that you get academic rules of debate. So things like, expectations of politically correct language, etc., which limits people's abilities to express themselves within this movement. I think that's incredibly harmful because these movements often act as a safe space for these people to express themselves in a way they want to in the first place, which means you, one, get worse representation because you don't have the same kind of people speaking within debates in this movement. So that probably translates into policy proposals. But secondly, you can no longer express yourself in the way you want. I think that's incredibly harmful if you're already suffering from discrimination. For all of those reasons, vote opening.
Thanks for that speech. Hello.
Great. If people could put POIs in the chat, that'd be excellent, and I'll be sure to take one. Sorry, my timer just turned off. Panel, the single greatest development in fighting voter disenfranchisement in Georgia wasn't the individual standing on street corners with voter registration forms. It was the academics who used smartphone data usage to find that people in African-American precincts waited an average of 30% longer to vote, which the Justice Department then used as justification to sue the state. On our side of the house, we get better buy-in, we get better policy solutions, and we get better movements and better academics. For all these reasons, we're so proud to oppose. So I think first, we want to talk about framing. I think that in terms of linkages between the academy and grassroots activists, we say that it's unlikely that these academics are going to be the face of the movement, even if they are prominent. I think the example that Open in Government gives you of Cornel West is a perfect example where he is someone who is prominent, he's invited on talk shows, but I don't think anyone would say that he is the head of BLM or anything like that. Things that academization looks like are terminology, publications of theories around social justice, the importance of NGOs and advocacy organizations, as well as academics publishing academic research on social problems to legitimate them. A couple more reasons why, in response to OG, academics are unlikely to be figureheads. First and foremost, I think OG already hit on this when they said academics don't have charisma. If it is the case that they don't have the charisma to organize and galvanize these people, it is probably also the case that they do not have the charisma to rise to the top of organizations that they aren't even usually members of, to get the sort of attention to command that they sort of co-opt and crowd out the organizers that do have a lot of charisma and social ties within a community. Second, the career burdens of academia. Recognize that it's really hard to get tenure. You have to spend a ton of time publishing or perishing, basically. There's you're spending 80 hours a week on your job. It's just unlikely that you also have time to be a twin dual activist. Third, if they are mistrusted, as opening government says, it is unclear why these individuals would also not get buy-in or get buy-in and become like the head of these organizations. That seems like a weird tension in their case. And fourth, finally, they say that these academics are going to crowd out the space, but crowding out is premised on the idea that attention is zero sum, which they never end up explaining why attention for any social cause or movement is zero sum. Here is why it is not. First, in like the status quo, if you don't change anything or any level of attention given to a social movement, the media has a near infinite number of outlets. The internet has a near infinite capacity for discourse. Second, we say that you, like in our case, for telling you that you increase the amount of like buy-in and support that you get for a movement, which means instead of crowding out, the academics create more space for more voices within the movement, just because it's getting more attention and it's getting more buy-in. Now, government might respond, but some voices rise to the top. But we say that academics have a natural incentive to not be rising to the top because they are publishing in different spheres than activists. If an academic is publishing in the Journal of Politics and an activist is publishing in the New York Times, they both have the incentive to publish in these different spheres because that's what benefits their career. It is unclear to me how that is a crowding out effect. All right. On to my constructive then. First, academizing social justice movements give them greater legitimacy among those for whom like credentialism is important. Recognize that upper middle class voters who are like very persuadable and are oftentimes like moderates whose votes and supports are up for grabs are unlikely in the status quo to support social justice movements, which they perceive as radical. Why? This is important because they are disposed for liberalism, but have a reflective distaste for people who look like they are complaining. They oftentimes fear losing their social status and position in society because they're worried that when their relative advantage is taken from them, something else will also objectively be taken from them. They will be taxed higher, they will lose their wealth, etc. But these are the voters who are up for grabs, and that's important because that's what moves the needle on the level of buy-in you get from society. Why are other voters just less important? Because poor or minority individuals who are the target of social justice campaigns are probably going to support you either way, regardless of what the movement looks like, because it is going to be a marginal improvement on their status. And in places where like right-wing populism has taken root and the culture wars are being battled, it is like unclear to me why poor whites are going to ever support you when they've been radicalized into sort of like racist ideologies, if something's like a racial justice movement. At that point, these are the voters we care most about because those are the median voters that we flip towards getting support for things like Black Lives Matter, etc. So how do you end up flipping these voters? These are people who are usually persuaded by things like facts, not feelings. They are disproportionately not going to award sympathy to individuals who are unlike themselves, i.e. white people in the UK affording less sympathy to Muslim South Asian immigrants. What that means is that you are able to convince these skeptics when you have numbers because they do not buy personal experience, which is the relative area activists can capitalize on. You only get that when you're having academics doing studies. But second, we also reject the notion that this causes a feeling of disaffection among the disadvantaged that the movement centers on. Again, this directly clashes with what OG says. Why? Activists distill the work of haughty academics into understandable terms and instead increase the ability of individuals to talk with one another as interlocutors. They have the incentive to do this because they want cohesion in the movement, and they're going to be good at this because organizing is literally just a key skill in activism. And if they can't do this, then they're probably just generally ineffective and nothing changes on either side of the house. The burden for buy-in isn't attending a university, it's being able to understand distilled information that these organizers are likely to provide to these academics. Before I go into my second point, I'll talk to CG.
If you concede that academics have limited charisma and limited buy-in and are therefore can exist in a separate sphere from the social movement, what is their value to the social movement in and of itself?
Yeah, I literally just said they do research, they provide numbers, they give that data and statistics, like the fact that Black voters are waiting longer in line, and there's a way to quantify that problem, and then you're able to use that in like legal cases, you're able to use that to sort of galvanize people who aren't likely to believe personal experience. All of that benefit comes from academics, even if they're not the ones saying the conclusions of their research. All right. Second point then is how you get better advocacy and organizing, right? Academization isn't just making up phrases. Knowledge is a generative process. For example, when someone came up with the phrase critical race theory, that means a hermeneutic for assessing how race has shaped historical processes evolved. This means a couple things. First, it changes the way we teach, and it means that future generations are more likely to be educated in ways that make them naturally more predisposed to social justice processes. Second, it means that current generations change and like the way they assess and perceive knowledge and critically reflect on their own education. That means they're more likely to do things like learn about Black Wall Street or like the move bombing because they know their previous frameworks for history are insufficient when the academy tells them that. Second, we say that more social clout and focus on these studies means that more grant money is devoted to these topics. For example, the increasing amount of private research funds given to business schools now commissioning studies on how male and female colleagues interact in the wake of Me Too. That means you just get more knowledge. Third, we say that cities are more willing to participate in studies because they are designed to generate political capital. For example, the Washington, D.C. Metro Police participated in an RCT by Yale about whether wearing body cams affected conduct because Muriel Bowser really wanted to look woke. That means you get more knowledge on how to fight these problems. Why is that so important? The biggest problem with activism is once you have a problem and no clear policy solution because nobody has done research into this, there's no clear answer as to whether something is effective, individuals become apathetic and pessimistic in the face of a seemingly insurmountable problem. We change that by giving these individuals concrete solutions with data availability so that they know how effective they are and they can more accurately organize and galvanize the public. This is directly responsive to OG's analysis about how movements become less effective. We give people something to fight for. For all these reasons, proud to oppose.
Thanks for that, DPM.
Yes. Yep. Okay, cool. Give me one sec. I'm going to start off in 3, 2, 1. I just want to have a chat about 3 things. Firstly, what this process of academization specifically looks like, because I think the burden in this debate was missed by opening opposition. Secondly, talking about what happens externally to the movement and buy-in, and lastly, talking about internal to the movement. Before that, though, I just want to deal with the one claim we got at the top of OO, which is the thing about this isn't a trade-off because these academics lack charisma and they have academic other obligations and there's infinite attention. My first response to this is that oftentimes some of them might have charisma, right? Just because the average academic isn't particularly charismatic, some of them are. I mean, Ava's an academic or going to be, and she seems pretty charismatic. But secondly, I think that insofar as institutions want the topmost academic and want to get prominent people within their institutions, that means they're probably going to allow these academics some level of freedom. So the most star academics, people like Cornell West or people like Piven and Cloud in the 1980s, for instance, were allowed to engage in academia, engage in the movement to some extent because they're incredibly prominent academics who the institutions wanted to get. So the obligations they face on is problematic. But lastly, even if there's infinite sources of media, I would posit there still is a time trade-off for the reason that you can't watch infinite sources of media, even if infinite sources of media exist. And I would posit this media is likely to select the academic sorts of people to appear to represent the movement, for the reason that the people like the media executives who decide who shows up on the media have often got degrees themselves and often are more biased to favor these academics, which means that actually these people are the ones who represent the movement and it's not the bottom-up people. So there is a trade-off overall. Okay, let's be very sharp on what the comparative in this round actually is, because the motion is this House opposes, which means that it's not retrospective, it exists going forward, which means we need to think about the trajectory that academization is taking rather than the past trajectory or past benefits that may have come as a result of this academization. I think broadly there are kind of 2 ways of it's a long word, academization that have happened. Firstly was the first wave, people like Piven and Cloud or whoever existing in the 1980s, who often did the sorts of empirical measurement that Ava talked about in her speech. I think that these sorts of people sought to measure out the problems that these social movements faced, but also they implied things about social movement strategy. Why was this true? Firstly, these are the most pressing issues that existed at the time for the reason that, there was very limited research on this. But secondly, insofar as academics have an incentive to be innovative in order to try and get credit overall, they're most likely to engage in this sort of innovative thing, which in the 1980s was a sort of empirical research. And lastly, it was pressing insofar as there were social movements at the time. So that was what the first wave of academization looked like. And the point here is that the key benefits that OO seek to claim in terms of gathering data, etc., have already happened. And crucially, these are now elements of the toolbox of the social movement itself. Oftentimes the social movement have brought this empirical measurement in-house. So groups like the NAACP have done that. That's not what this debate is about then. The debate is about the second wave of academization, which happened more recently. And that's the thing that we oppose because it's the one that exists going forward. These are the sorts of things that Louisa talked about in her speech. Things like critical race theory, for instance, or these sorts of things. These sorts of considerations that generally tend to be post-materialist, they generally reflect the specific considerations of the academic rather than the sorts of empirical things that Ava wants. Why is this true? Firstly, insofar as the same thing I said before exists, that academics have an incentive to be innovative and do original research, but crucially the empirical research has already happened, that means they focus more on these sorts of things like microaggressions, etc. You get D'Angelo, who's the person who wrote about white fragility, for instance. But secondly, I think that we get this sort of research increasingly for the reason that insofar as the empirical measurement has already happened to an extent and people accept that these are problems, the question is more just focusing on things that aren't measurable, right? Things like, microaggressions, etc. And that's what academic currently focuses on. I think this is important because I think that means on both sides of the house, the social movement has good ability to do the sorts of empirical measurement and organizing that OO wants, but it's only on their side of the house they have to defend the increased academization and increased detachment of these sorts of social movement from the social movement itself. Before I continue closing,
so the first wave, second wave analysis might neatly apply to the big developed countries both you and opening opposition come from. How does it play out in places with less developed educational institutions?
I would posit that social movements in these places firstly have less power even in the first place for the reason that the social movements aren't as developed in these areas. But I'd also posit this distinction applies there too, right? Like oftentimes there was a wave of academics in the sorts of group that I'm talking about who exist in these areas and analyze things like Latin American social movements, for instance. So I don't think that applies. Okay, secondly then, what happens to external buy-in in the median voter? Because the opening opposition claim here was that these people were persuaded by like empirical data and stuff, which is good. My first observation is that literally the framing I've just given has already dealt with this, but also it's unclear how big this group actually is. Like it's unclear why they're meaningfully tipping point these like well-educated voters, and they never do the legwork to show this. But thirdly, and I think crucially, they never prove that these people will be persuaded by the specific academic groups that like the specific left-wing academic groups who are part of the social movement, right? They just prove that they're persuadable by academics. But the point is that Louisa says that insofar as academics become increasingly prominent within social movements, the right-wing groups have an incentive to get their own academics, people like Jordan Peterson, whoever, who count against this and come up with their own pseudoscientific facts. And it's unclear at that point at which group of people these sorts of people will prefer. So even in their best case scenario, it's an incredibly uncertain benefit that they get off the sort of median voter. But lastly, I think that this research can still happen on both sides to an extent, right? The problem is that it just doesn't happen internal to the social movement and doesn't come to dominate the social movement in the ways that we suggest. Secondly then, what happens to the movement internally? What they say is that these academics tend to be good at organizing things and they put funding towards studies, etc., which is likely to be beneficial because people want to come off as being woke. My first response to this is to say that I think people might want to come off as being woke, but that just means that they want to look into these social movements overall, and it's unclear why the academics themselves are a necessary condition in order to get this access. Like, insofar as people are suffering and there's protests going on outside, right, presumably want to make some sorts of concessions to them and to ensure their lives improve. But secondly, I would posit that the harm that we give you in terms of internal structure of the movement is actually really problematic. Insofar as these people then crowd out the authentic voice which exists because, they come to dominate the social movement overall and they have their own academic terminology, which is incredibly inaccessible to people. I think that's a massive harm for these individuals who get crowded out because the social movement is the only sphere they have to actual speech. It's the only place they can actually be heard in the first place and get considered as being an important voice. I think that's an incredibly important thing for people to feel heard, to feel listened to, and to feel like their identity can be expressed in external places. So I think it's very glib for opening opposition to just mitigate out this impact in the round. I think it's incredibly important for these people. And I'd say it's probably at least as, if not more important than abstract policy change, which they say, which probably only happens down the line. It's probably also reversible because, any policy can be revoked. It often gets dragged through the political quagmire and gets dragged through gridlock. And so insofar as that benefit's incredibly uncertain, whereas we give you the certain benefit of being crowded out and not being heard anymore, and that's probably more important. For all these reasons, very proud to stand on open government.
Thanks for that, Taylor.
in the chat. I would appreciate that. We are the only team in this debate that has said anything at all about how you actually make progress for social justice movements that in the status quo suffer systemically from a lack of legitimacy among the middle class, moderate, centrist, and nominally leftist or liberal people who have the power to confer things like capital to the movements, political voting and stuff like that to actually make differences in people's lives. On opening government, it's unclear why that ever happens. A few things before I talk about the collapse in this debate. First, I think OG tries to frame this as like their side gets to talk about lived experiences and we don't. I want to be clear that this is not the comparative for 3 reasons. First, because the theories that we are talking about that are part of academization are themselves generated from observation. The way you know this is that if you had a theory like critical race theory that's totally devoid from the fact that from like descriptions of how racism plays out in people's lives, you would never have the credibility as an academic to do things like survive peer review or get public or not get laughed out of conferences. But B, the academics' own lived experiences inform these kinds of theories and academics that get generated and pushed into these movements. More on this later. But C, I think Eva explains that academics are unlikely to be figureheads if they aren't, as OG says, the like charismatic figures with a lot of times like devote to this. OG also tells us that the empirics have already happened and that this is just about microaggressions. 4 things to say to this. First, the idea that we are somehow done learning about all of the empirical issues in the world that are affecting marginalized groups is, I think, facially absurd to us. I don't know why universities exist if this is the case. B, even in their best case for OG, I think these small things that they talk, so-called small things like microaggressions and white fragility are extremely important too. Why? Because in most of the world, open racism and de jure like segregation and like sexism and stuff like that are nominally over. That is to say, the urgent social justice movements right now are about pointing out to people where the blind spots are in the progress that we think we have made. Specifically, talking about things like the way that we talk to each other differently depending on race, i.e. microaggressions, are things that are actually really important to billions of people. But C, even if you don't believe that, I think talking about these so-called small issues primes people to work on the bigger issues. And finally, I think the development of theories drives you to find even more observations that are important to people. So when you talk about things like critical race theory, that drives you to look at where in our society racism exists, even if we haven't noticed it yet. Cool. 2 things in this debate. First, how do you get the people in society on your side who can make a difference? What is the weighing here? If you're concerned about crowding out or feeling alienated within the movement, I think it's still more important to have successful political action to improve people's material condition. That is, doing things like investing in lead pipe removals after you have critical race theory point you to the fact that even in places where we don't think there are racism, there often is racism. These are things that actually save people's lives, do things like prevent crime. So to the extent that we are able to actually improve people's material conditions, I think that's more important. The logic of the OG also proves this weighing because the point of their crowding out argument is just like people feel worse. Well, I think people feel better when you decrease the issues that are making them feel bad or feel like they have to be activists in the first place. 2 spheres in which we improve political action. First, on the most persuadable people, that is moderates, swing voters, and liberals. 4 things to say about this. First, Eva points out, doesn't get responded to, that we confer the respect of like the academy on these people. When you see a Stanford professor standing up and explaining that there are certain issues that are pervasive in our society, you are someone who is more likely to listen, even though you previously weren't when the marginalized communities who like maybe live in like a relatively like, segregated area, so you never have to interact with the marginalized communities and activists in the first place who are not that aware of the issues. Now, because you respect the person who's talking to you, you are more likely to understand what's going on. Second, oftentimes people send their kids to universities where these academics are actually developing these theories, and so those kids get exposed to them. The long-range weighing here is that the fact that more and more people go to college because it is a de facto expectation to get a quality job means that you get more people exposed to these kinds of ideas and more willing to accept them. 3, you provide more respectable or you provide more material for executive and administrative action that's less dependent on democratic action. That is to say, even if we don't convince anyone in the democratic populace to do these things, you still have bureaucracies that are more disposed to actually embrace these kinds of academic ideas and use them to drive action. Why? Because judges, especially, or people who go to law school, have a disposition toward intellectual theories, and so are more likely to buy all of these arguments in a courtroom where you don't depend on democratic action. Fourth, OG says that there's a time trade-off here, right? They say that there's a limited amount of time to watch grassroots people, and so versus like academics, so it's worse for democratic action because you don't see lived experiences. There are three issues with this. First, because people's curiosity is going to be provoked when they hear something that they're unfamiliar with on TV, even if this trade-off is true. That's to say, I don't know what critical race theory is, but like general like descriptions of like racism or brutality may be old news to me, and I may have block myself out from that, but I don't tune it out because I hear something new. I'll take CO before I move on, or CG.
For your argument to be true, you have to prove to me that this academic research won't happen if they're not increasingly academizing social justice movements.
Yeah, so here's the comparative. On your side of the house, conservatives are still always doing academic research on things that are like antithetical to the social justice goals that we have on both sides of the house. The difference on our side of the house is that we engage academics in social justice to actually create research that counters those harmful narratives. So you have to defend that on your side of the house. Here's the thing. Even in the case where academization fails or alienates conservatives or whatever, we create a lot of space for less aggressive but still positive change. Why? We expand the Overton window. That is to say, what people consider extreme typically is anchored on the most left or most right thing they hear, and so they adjust accordingly. To the extent that this is true, it creates space for progress for those who separate themselves from the academic part and can portray themselves as less elitist. So the example here is police abolitionism, very popular in the academy, gets targeted by conservatives, but then moderates like Kamala Harris or Jim Clyburn now look a lot more acceptable when they stay away from that debate and instead propose more moderate things like reforms to the way police officers get treated after an officer-involved shooting. To the extent that this is true, then we still have a marginal improvement on our side of the house because we get you closer to the less extreme changes that OG wants us to make. Finally, how do people feel within the movement? I already weighed against this. What I would point out, though, is that you increase solidarity within these movements when you show that there are people outside of their communities who are just as engaged, or at least care in a nominal sense about the issues that are facing them. Even if you do not speak the same exact, or speak in the same exact terms, I think that's still a positive thing because the biggest detriment to hope for advocacy in marginalized communities is feeling like no one else is listening to you or no one else even like sees your issue. To the extent that you create a bridge between these communities and the rest of society, we say you're better off and you're happier as an activist within these kinds of communities. For those reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
Thanks for that speech, and not.
Two, one. It's honestly really funny being the only ESL team in this debate because I think they forget that academia is excessively anglicized to the point at which there are structural reasons why the academia that you so think creates political change has structural reasons for fractioning people across borders, but internally too. And I think that's the issue. So I'll first talk about that as to why academia is anglicized and why that leads to fractioning. But second, I'll talk to you about why academic terminology is dehumanizing to the point that it's not inaccessible, like OG says. I think that's a weak impact. It's actively excluding and saying fuck you to people who actively go and protest and bring change. And panel, I think that's problematic. Just a broad response to OO before I go on, because most of this would be integrated in my speech. They say that academics aren't figureheads, they're supplementary individuals that are crucial to enact political change because without their data, you cannot have political change. Panel, I think it is first important to note that leftist researchers will still research on social justice movements like excessively. I just don't think you can claim that just because they're not an integral part of social justice movement, people will lose the inspiration to do research and show qualitative data. But second, and quite importantly, panel, I don't think social justice movements need to come up with solutions. Here's why. Because they're extremely decentralized, often can come to a conclusion, and they are subject to decision bottlenecks. The function of social justice movements is to select politicians who then in the Senate or like the Congress, when they debate, they use these as supplemental tools to show that there is evidence to support these things. What you need to cater to is not make social justice movements reach solutions, but have people feel included enough that they don't think that just because we don't know fancy words, we are probably not being heard, like struggles of an ESL speaker all my life, right? All right, so let's talk about why academia is anglicized. And note that this is much more important than OG, only because it provides structural rather than individualistic reasons of crowding out. This provides structural reasons as to why, even in OO's best case, it's just bad. So first, because research was historically dominated by people from the West, it was gatekept and taught by people from the West, which again, predominantly English speakers. But second, the publication and knowledge transfer, knowledge dispersion, all things like that, all publishing houses, etc., all universities, etc., that taught these books were often English heavy or whatever you call that. Even if CEO comes up and tells you that Global South does research too and that those researches are meaningful, it is often done by the import of Western knowledge to the point at which it's majorly talked about in that form. So these three structural reasons prove to you a simple thing, that academic dominance is asymmetrically anglicized insofar as it is not representative of the people who are mostly the colonized, who don't like to speak that language, historically didn't like to speak that language, still doesn't like to speak that language, but we got to do what we got to do. All right, impacts. It fractions the movement based on your proximity to English speaking entities. So for example, EFL speakers, people who are often not as eloquently knowledgeable about these academic research papers, which by the way, isn't accessible to read if you think about it, because if you have read an academic research paper during your time in college and got a C in it, you know how difficult it is, even if you're reasonably smart. Impacts of this panel, twofold. One, it makes your movements weaker because it creates disassociation through country lines. That is to say, panel, India and other South Asian nations, for example, just as an example, think these sorts of social justice movements are a Western import. The reason why that's problematic, panel, because they think oh, you talk about pronouns, that's a very Western import, we don't want that. But the issue is, panel, if you look at the Bengali language, for example, we don't have pronouns. And the reason why this is crucial is because it is the academization that makes these things seem so West that it doesn't fit in your culture. That means, panel, people in Bangladesh who would probably want to stand against Islamophobia, probably wants to look back at their history of accepting transgender individuals, etc., when approached by social justice movements using these academized terms, just disassociate, period, and don't collectivize. This is quite important because this is worlds and this is not Nats. You can't talk about USA and win this debate, or like London for that matter. Second, it is unfairly creates internal fractions. And now I would like to use an example of one of the worst historic divisions between collective movements. So in the post-MLK era, the Combahee River Collective, combined with the consisting of the Navajo and Pequot Native American collectives, essentially paired up with Black feminist groups in order to tackle white supremacy. These indigenous people, panel, in the movement were given less media attention, were systematically alienated to the point at which they had to detract from the movement because their voices weren't heard. You know why, panel? They did not speak English. They did not know academic terms and things like that. They were significantly less persuasive. They were significantly less relevant. And that is what, panel, makes this internal fracturing a structural issue when you academize. It's not individuals crowding things out. It's the fact that these words are inaccessible, period. I think that is counterfactually fixed under our world when you have language of academia is not the main barrier to accessing social movements. Before that,
The problem with your analysis is that developing countries have academics who come up with their ideas and adapt them to cultural context to improve the standing of their own academic circuits. In developing countries with even more inequality, universities have strong cultural capital because few people get to go to them. That's why we get buy-in from developing world politicians.
That panel, that just doesn't happen. And I already told you that even if you think that academics exist in these sorts of areas, they refer to this Western academia because that's the only source that is necessary. They do research on that, and translations aren't as good as you think they are. All right. Second, why is this academic terminology dehumanizing? Because you turn people into numbers. You crowd pain in versions of philosophies and broad ideas. And OO can't go like, no, it encompasses lived experiences, because it doesn't. It puts it in one page of the 100 pages that you essentially post in. Why is that problematic, panel? Because it makes people who feel guilty or feel bad because they feel like they're not wise enough to speak in their own social justice movement. This is extremely problematic, panel, because change occurs when you feel like you have a place, when you feel like you can say, not when people from O go like, you don't have a solution, don't talk about it. We have research, we'll explain this to you. That, panel, is the massive impact of academization. It's dehumanizing, and it makes people feel like they can't talk about it. It's not inaccessible. For all of these reasons, panel, very proud to be CG.
Thanks for your speech. Op member.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Closing opposition today is going to give you several extensions as to the benefit of actually having academics integrated with activism. And that is to say that, yes, we accept that obviously academics will be researching on a lot of things all the time. This is crucially the benefits that uniquely come from this kind of integration. I'm going to talk about, firstly, why this terminology actually provides safe spaces internally within movements and provides a voice for the comparative that these individuals don't have a voice due to the pre-existing bias for language and eloquence. That usually means that within movements, you have privileges within privileges, minorities within minorities. The language of intersectionality is academic in and of itself, and that provides a way to break that down and provide a reason to give safe spaces. Secondly, I'm going to explain why, beyond the idea of just having research that would already happen, having a close connection results in more activists in academia, and therefore more lived experiences being taught to real life, the future generations. But secondly, why the comparative of current academic literature that is effectively harmful to our movements will never be combated under government side. Finally, I'm going to extend inwards in terms of why the types of terminology that is used doesn't necessarily lead to turnout, but effectively focuses the social movements on solving the real problems that affect people and explaining or giving them, reframing the idea of that oppression. Firstly, in terms of people not able to access its terminology and why that's actually wrong. The first is that academic terminology is crucial to understanding dynamics within those systems. So the comparative is you have the feminist movement dominated by privileged white women, or you have Native Americans who can't speak English and aren't as affluent, already being able to have that discrimination against them just by virtue of people prioritizing the ability of communication, right? That is nothing to do with academic language specifically. It's just that those biases already exist. How does this change on our side? It looks like Kimberly Crenshaw, who's able to come up with the idea of intersectionality that not only convinced a lot of white people to actually think about racism, take racism seriously, but also carved out a space for minorities within the feminist movement, right? And I got the feminist movement to firstly have respect for their individual different experiences within the movement, but also gave them and forced them to give a place for them to have a voice. And that means that in this response of CG and to OG, that you aren't actually in the comparative being able to give them a voice. The academic language itself doesn't take away the voice from people for several reasons. The first thing is that these minorities within minorities are already voiceless, right? Especially within their movement. Because when you have to talk about your experiences in terms of emotive terms, then obviously the loudest and most privileged win out, because you're weighing up like the emotion of experience that is obviously equal subjectively within each individual. You have to explain in academic terms that there's a difference that you can actually measure that is not like a subjective claim, but an objective claim of privilege. And that requires extra thinking within that movement to put that in place. Again, the comparative is not that you have these academics filling up the moment these academics leave, even if that was the case, just powerful voices take over. We've already explained why comparatively you're better at that. Secondly, in terms of what this academic integration kind of looks like, I've already explained how opening government talks about like research. This is the full clashes debate, right? We actually get the reverse of what OG wants in terms of academics going into activism. You get activists coming into academia as well. We want that to happen. We want these teachers to be involved in the movement, but also those movement individuals becoming teachers and furthering that cause. Why is this likely to happen on our side? So firstly, you have this academics in the movement, right? So the people who are involved in the movement and experience that movement day to day reinforces those beliefs that they themselves will go back and teach, but also as an incentive now to diversify university spaces and provide like scholarships to activists, or they lose face with that movement, right? Which means we get a lot of people going in and learning academic articles about or academic literature about their own movement, but you also get these individuals now who are passionate about this, have the same lived experiences because they're minorities now teaching in these universities. So actually you have teaching, that you have teachers who are in tune with those lived experiences and the more diverse stuff. That is important because they're teaching the future generation to get the kind of cultural change that that opening was talking about, and building elite consensus to stay for further in the future. This again, it takes down opening government's case, which assumes that lobbying, the oppositional lobbying of academics came as a response to this. It's not. It's been around for ages, right? The counterfactual of lived experience actually never convinces those individuals, because you're not convincing the individuals that have a similar disadvantage. These elites, the privileged in terms of a struggle against them, looks like, like the bell jar, where you have scientific basis for racism, or Dworkin having like justifying Islamophobia by the selfish gene and shitting on religion all the time. The comparative is you're not going to solve this method any other way than by having the power and the power of academia behind you to stop that. I'll take opening government before I move on.
The problem is this doesn't deal with our framing, which is that this debate looks forward, which means things like intersectionality, etc., already exist, and academia is already more diverse. So the problem that you're talking about doesn't exist anymore.
Look, if you're trying to tell me that we've solved a lot of problems that never have come up again, that is just factually untrue, right? There's intersectionality in developing countries that haven't been sorted yet. There's intersectionality in developed countries in terms of the LGBTQ and trans individuals and feminism that haven't been even talked about yet. There's a lot left to discuss in terms of those research. I'm going to explain why it's not just intersectionality that provides justification for diverse discussion, but this as well. Remember, this then obviously responds to a lot of what you heard from closing government. I'm sure you'll get a lot from Daniel about this, right? So obviously the Native American example has a pre-existing bias to it. You're able now to explain relative comparative on our side. Let's talk about political action, right? Remember, turnout is probably going to be very marginal because people who have respect for those institutions likely already have a liberal focus. Judicial change, again, as explained by opening government, not as effective as political change. How do we actually change this? Closing government says the role of the movement is to pick politicians to then use the research that opening opposition wants to talk about. But this is about how you pick those politicians and how you signal to politicians what you care about. Note, the types of people that respond to the emotive imagery of police brutality are likely to turn out anywhere on either side because that imagery is out there. What changes is how they understand the problem. So this is where we come to what academic terminology actually means, because no one has clarified that so far. It looks like terms like structural racism that has a lot behind it, a lot of nuance that most people don't actually need to understand the full extent of. But it changes how they perceive those individual moments of police brutality and tie it back to a structural, systematic problem that now they have an incentive to actually push for that type of change. And that happens in a lot of different areas, right? In terms of how people actually perceive other people's lived experiences. They can't perceive it directly. They have to use words. They don't have to be academic about it, but those words and reframing of the problem actually allows for actual political focus on solutions that solve those issues and not just solutions that solve short-term problems. Side with closing opposition.
Thanks for your speech, and Kavit.
at the outset how you should weigh the different contributions of the team. Opening government, I think, pinned their entire case on a lazy characterization of the types of people that will rise up. I think this is clearly beaten by opening opposition, but we go significantly further and explain the types of people who are likely to gain the most power and integration in those movements are the ones who avoid the types of traps that opening government describes. And Cornel West is an excellent example. He doesn't focus on microaggressions, rather he focuses on material deprivation of African-American people informed by his lived experience as someone who was poor growing up. Closing government just gives us a substantially more sophisticated version of the case that comes from opening government. Beyond it being a class division, they say there's an Anglo versus the rest of the world distinction, and that we import Western complexes. The reason why we take it over closing government is we explain that the people who are able to gain marginal power tend to be the people who within those existing communities are the ones who had the least power. Because you have to ask who is being displaced, and the dominance of these other groups within your society means that the types of voices that they want never rise to the top unless they're able to access academic language. And importantly, we break down the gatekeeping that is their essential harm, that academics are locked out, flipping their contribution entirely. Then lastly, we beat over opening opposition because they simply defend left-wing academics. They don't really argue for breaking down the siloing between left-wing academia and left-wing activism. They say, firstly, we convince moderates and liberals. We agree, but not in the way that they have set out. It's not through your arguments we are able to convince these people, but rather because universities are factories for tomorrow's elites, and we have significant cultural power in shifting those types of consensuses. And secondly, they say that we do better research. We firstly explain where it happens. It's much more likely to be Epele Haufa than people from Harvard. And it's also, that does not require an academization of social justice until closing opposition comes in and explain to you why breaking down those siloings, having mechanisms to get people in, making sure that professors engage with people's lived experiences improves the quality of that research, even though I think it's fair to point out that it's unclear how the quantity increases with the case that from opening government. So I'm going to then firstly walk through closing government with the government bench, because I think many of our responses are the same, but we take the case at its best at closing government, and then explain why we take it over opening opposition, particularly with our argument around the factories of elites and how you actually generate the types of consensus that leads to structural policy change, because this is a structural debate, and we are the ones who provide the best structural solutions. So looking at closing government, I think they go significantly beyond opening opposition, because it's not just about these movements being inaccessible, it's about these movements being perverted by people who come from outside organizations and creating backlash within those communities who reject the imposition of those types of ideas. I would first deal with a smaller claim they had within this debate, that you simply can't get protests, or that somehow protests are linked to this academic language. Note that the big protests that you get tend to come from the emotive response you have to crises. Say, for example, the massive protests in New Delhi against violence to women, sparking from the attack of a young woman, or of course Black Lives Matter, which comes across many attacks on people. What academics do is they make sense and organize post those events, bring people together in a way that allows them to have a more effective response. So the first contention is to ask yourself who actually rises. And I think this is where we most clearly beat opening government, because they tell us simply the most annoying people rise within these movements. But we tell you that those people overwhelmingly get rejected by social movements, have the least cachet within social movements, and never become dominant as closing government wanted to somehow input into this motion without justifying how those people become dominant. And I think the best example is the fact that post-colonial critiques, which are dominant at universities all across the developing world, explicitly take issue with the Western canon of academia, criticize it rather than implementing it wholesale. And specifically at the intersection of social justice, this is important, because there's a self-correction mechanism that academics need to be invited back to these social protests. They need to find ways to make it true to the lived experiences of those individuals. They need to have the legitimacy of those movements behind them. Otherwise, they get pulled down and get claimed that they are not representative and simply self-aggrandizing. There's a lot of self-correction mechanisms that I think, because opening government spends too much time on Twitter, where people self-aggrandize themselves all the time and claim that they're significantly more important in the movement, and closing government makes broad, sweeping statements about how developing world institutions just close their eyes and listen to whatever Westerners say, fails to take into account the idea that you have a rejection there. But I think there are two more important responses, or equally important responses, to come at closing government. The first is to say they don't reckon with pre-existing biases within those communities. The groups that they say will get marginalized don't suddenly gain power in a world where we don't have academization of these languages. Because A, there's pre-existing biases against these groups. B, you have a broader bias towards English and clear language communication. And thirdly, you have popular culture dominance of English and that as a media of communication. So those types of people are locked out under either side of the house. This is where Shah's extension is outstanding, because what he explains to you is you're able to challenge those power structures, gives you a language, Kimberly Crenshaw, pointing out that African-American women who do not have the soft cultural power like Black African-American men do, are then given a language and structure by which they can challenge those power structures. If you look at Sri Lankans and Tamils, it gives them a common language by which to discuss the issues that beset those two organizations, take out the vitriol and allow calm communication. So that clearly takes it up. Then there's the two further bits of extension. Before that, opening government.
Which progressive research are swing voters more likely to believe? Research done by an in-house BLM researcher or by a researcher who doesn't have that official association?
I'm sorry to be brutal, but you misunderstand the motion. If BLM is hiring academics, that is the academization of social justice movements. So, two external convincing people. So the first thing we do, and we go further in opening opposition, is we provide academic cover against the scientific racism that comes from people like Jordan Peterson. And I think opening government is a little bit cheeky and clever here, because what they want to say is Jordan Peterson bounced off this type of interaction in order to build their appeal. There's no evidence of that. Scientific racism's been around for a long time. And then the extension and closing government concedes the case that we give, because they can see that universities have normative power, but they don't justify why it's used in a bad way. But it's not the research, though we do explain why that research is better. It's about building elite consensus and teaching, which builds us to the further reason, just beyond just the fact that we are the only team able to beat closing government and opening government, as to why we take it over opening opposition. Because we explain to you why universities are important for creating elite consensus, because they are the cultural institution at the heart of many of those elites. All lawyers, all judges, almost every politician goes through university. That's where their idea implicated with these ideas. So we do three things, the mechanisms missing at opening opposition. Firstly, now there are strong incentives for academics to try and get more activists into the institution, providing things like scholarship and mentorships, otherwise they can be criticized or cut out. Secondly, it exposes them to these lived experiences, which means that their research is better. So we improve the research. But secondly, we also now have teaching and culture that goes to the very heart of how people make decisions into the future. There's a reason why casual racism has become almost impossible to express in polite society, and that's because of the way that universities from the 60s have driven these movements. We are extremely happy to be pro-academization.
Awesome. Thanks very much for wonderful